Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto is the first official Gothic story, as it claims on its title page, and this name derives from the then crumbling Gothic churches that were slowly being consumed by nature, conjuring a sense of impending doom and the daunting relentless indifference of time's ravenous devouring. The imagery of decay and corruption and dilapidation often accompanied this Gothic genre. It became popular in Britain and Germany afterwards, stemming from the English and Northern European in general tradition of telling ghost stories around Christmas time, of which The Castle of Otranto was published on Christmas Eve. Let it be also known that Shakespeare was also a heavy influence upon Otranto and many of these other Gothic writers, right? Because what is really Gothic without Hamlet talking to ghosts and King Lear's insanity? So much that we find in Shakespeare does seem to sort of be the stepping stone into the sort of Gothic Baroque era, but we'll leave that maybe for another day. Famous novels of the more supernatural persuasion claim this genre, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula. Imagery of ghoulish, rotting flesh and the revenant undead find their homes in this scene. A more modern and romantic rendition of the genre features endangered heroines, with notable titles like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Americans like Edgar Allan Poe, William Faulkner, and Cormac McCarthy would find some of the same shadows of the looming European cathedrals and American plantation manors and frontier borderlands. Quote, Gothic atmospheres, gloomy and mysterious, have repeatedly signaled the disturbing return of past upon present and invoked emotions of terror and laughter. Fred Boating, Gothic. Although what we know today as the Gothic genre emerged around the 18th and 19th century, and still today in our modern era continues to captivate us with like the recent Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, many of these maybe disparate elements like female leads and undead spooky elements all seem to find their origins perhaps in an earlier Viking saga, or maybe rather poem, that also features the word Gothic itself. I speak of Hervararkviða, aka in English as the Waking of Angantyr or Incantation of Hervor, which itself comes from a larger legendary saga called the Hervara saga och Heidreks, or the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. Lost family heirlooms, undead rising from haunted graves, and the shield maiden main character all feature in this short poem that was notably one of Tolkien's favorite pieces and inspirations. Much like the genre itself, we are now going to impose the past upon the present and rewind the clock 600 years to see just what's in Gothic's skeleton-riddled closet. Quote, the Gothic wants to see the relationship between the modern world and the past, not as one of evolution or development, but one of sudden juxtaposition and of often violent conflict, in which the past erupts within the present and deranges it, and in one of the most powerful motifs of that is, of course, the ghost. The thing that you think is dead becomes back vividly alive in the present. One really useful term for thinking about Gothic writing is the uncanny. Now, this is a term that comes from Sigmund Freud, so something that's new, but that also takes us back to something, either in our own psychological past or something in the world that's archaic. John Bowen, the Gothic. So for a quick summary, the Waking of Angantyr is actually from a longer piece called the Heidrek Saga, and that sort of deals with this legendary 4th century conflict between the Goths and the Huns. And to me, and probably later other revisionist historians, see this as a sort of pivotal moment in history, as sort of another example of West versus East, much like a Persians versus Greeks at the Battle of Thermopylae, as an Eastern power going to push full into the Western sphere. But here, maybe in the Gothic sort of reminiscing and how they've been mythologized, maybe in a sense, is that they make a sort of a grand stand against this and eventually, come up on their own and ransack Rome. The poem is known as Hervararkviða in Old Norse, and the diction of this section has scholars, including the likes of Tolkien, speculating that the poem might be the oldest part of the saga itself, a remnant from an earlier oral tradition. There's much to be discovered still, to say the least. In short, the poem is about a shield maiden named Hervor, who heads to the burial grounds of her father and 11 berserkle uncles to retrieve a magical sword for revenge and glory. It's badass. But the mood and imagery of this short poem exudes all the elements one might find in a modern Gothic tale. So first off, we have our heroine figure, Hervor, and she's sort of like a Joan of Arc sort of mold. I feel like there's a lot of feminist modern reading and mileage here that can be sort of taken with this character, because we have this lead female shield maiden character, and she's got a lot more Odinic vibes, and she's even talked about and described as having a rune carved spear and using it to summon her undead father, essentially. Hervarth, Hjorvarth, Harani, Angantyr, I wake you all below the tree's roots, with helmet and byrnie, with sharp sword, and shield and harness, with reddened spear. One might recall the determined warrior daughter, Eowyn, in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, who slays the Nazgul Witch King, Angmar, in the third book. At which the name Angmar sounds a lot like our girl Hervar's grandfather and father, Arngrim and Angantyr, respectively. Eowyn's arc is also about her relationship with her father, legacy, and someone revenging and coming to his aid against the Witch King. Hervar's fathers and uncles were slain in battle on the island of Samso by another pair of legendary figures, Hjalmar and Overawd, and after discovering her birthright, then sets forth to the gravesite to retrieve the dwarven forged blade, Tyrfinger, sometimes translated literally as Tyr's finger, or perhaps related to the other Germanic tribes known as Tervingi, which then might crack this whole poem open up and perhaps be a metaphor for intertribal Gothic relationships in this sort of 4th century era. The slaying of Angantyr and the berserkers by Hjalmar and Odd are also mentioned in the works of Saxo Grammaticus the Dane, who was born around 1150, demonstrating that some element of this narrative are quite old, older than the 14th and 17th century documents of the relevant Norse sagas. More of this Gothic versus Hun tradition is also in the Old English poem Widsith. Samso is the same island mentioned in the Poetic Edda story Lokasenna, where Loki references Odin practicing cider magic there, quote, beating on the drums as seeresses do. If you follow the channel, you know that I'm a fan of synchronicities, and if you want to know more about my little experience with this island called Samso, stick around to the end of the video. So Hervor dresses up and goes rowing with some Vikings, calling herself Hervard, and eventually takes the crew there, promising that great treasure and wealth would be found there, but even Vikings want nothing to do with the place, and that, quote, it was worse there in daylight than in many other places in the dark. Hervor nonetheless takes a boat there and arrives at the hour of sunset. The poem opens up in a classic Gothic fashion, with a setting sun upon an ominous, misty, shrouded island, and here comes up an old sheep herder doing the classic "turn back now" motif, warning our character that danger looms ahead.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
God, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get. Leave people alone.
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
It's got a death curse.
Please don't go to Aylmarsh House.
But our heroine of this tale is no mere damsel, of course. She is a battle-hardened shield maiden. Hervar even refers to this island dweller sheep herder as Eyjar Skeggjar, literally island bearded, conjuring the image of a disheveled castaway who has missed a few too many haircuts, completing the tropey image of picturing the sheep herder as a crazed hermit, invoking the sense of taking a few too many wrong turns on the way to the isolated cabin in the woods, and knowing that you're officially outside of normal society in some sort of liminal space between worlds. The sheepherder pleads for Hervor to leave as the environment itself seems threatening, that fires are moving, mounds are opening, burning field and fen. Once again, is this not the classic opening of a Gothic story? Of a heroine on her way to the mist-shrouded haunted manor, with the first signs of unease foreshadowing appearing as warnings? Well, this is a Viking story, so naturally Hervor is unfazed by all of this, and continues towards the burning mounds through fire, quote, as if they were no more than mist, until she came to the barrow of the berserks. So while this poem is doing the whole Gothic setup in so many ways, it's also undercutting our modern sensibility of it with this stoic, no-nonsense Hervor. In the words of YouTuber and academic Dr. Justin Sledge on his video about the Gothic, trope or aesthetic, he described it as invoking ash, blood, insects crawling, and decay as senses, of which this poem definitely has in spades, and pun intended as we're about to talk about zombies. Now, instead of the scene being an anxious character wandering into the spooky mansion, asking the clearly haunted house, "Is anyone there?" our warrior heroine starts shouting and berating the restless dead to give her some magic weapons. "Wake, Angantyr! Wakes you Hervor, Svafa's offspring, your only daughter, the keen-edged blade from the barrow give me, the sword dwarf smithied for Sir Lami. Hervor, Hjarvar, Hrani, Angantyr, from the roots of the tree I arouse you all, with helm and corselet, keen-edged weapon, gear and buckler, and graven spear." Just as in Dr. Sledge's description, Hervor mocks the dead berserkers, that the once fearsome, violent kin have become all but dust in their barrows, and she threatens that their corpses will be consumed and riddled by ants or maggots, depending on your translation, and if they do not answer. Bug-infested, rotting bodies and dusty skeletons. Check, Dr. Sledge. Angantyr's voice can be heard on the wind, and he is entirely aghast at what his daughter is doing, warning that she would wake dead men with her shouting, filled with curses, saying that she's become mad and senseless, delirious for doing so. A common aspect to Gothic horror is the psyche and mental stability, whether the ghosts we see are real or not, or there are perhaps manifestations of past trauma lingering in the subconscious. Here we get the father questioning his daughter's mental faculties for visiting a haunted island at night to use necromancy on undead Vikings. Maybe he has a point here. She says, "Tell it true, so the god should leave you whole in the mound, if you do not have Tyrfing with you. You're reluctant to give your inheritance to your only child." Angantyr tries to pretend he doesn't have the sword, but Hervor calls him out and threatens that a god, As, will leave him whole in the mound if he's lying. The Norse poem uses the word As for god in singular form. It is more commonly recognized in its plural form, Asir or Aesir, and I've often wondered what god Hervor had in mind here. Naturally, I like to think that she meant Odin, since we're already here on Samso. She's using necromancy, as Odin does in Voluspa, with the use of an inlaid or rune-carved spear, Odinic again, and that if Odin was chooser of the slain, perhaps Hervor is referencing a non-glorious afterlife for Angantyr if he were not to comply honorably. Hervor demands Tyrfingr, the inheritance of Angantyr's only child, to which then the grave mounds burst open, as if the whole mound were fire and flame. Angantyr warns that the sword will be the ruin and end of her family, and that she will bear a son to wield the sword. Family legacies can often be attached to symbols such as like the family manor, or in this case, a sword. When we think of Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, we're presented a dilapidated and crumbling house, mirroring the decay of the same family's essence and virility, a lack of inheritance to give or receive. This concept of inheritance is a recurring theme in the Western canon, and the sword of Tyrfingr is the key to Hervor's place in the world, and ultimately her son's. The mystery and legends of the awaiting sword, like that of King Arthur's Excalibur, a sword found and then later deposited into water, awaiting a rightful seeker to claim it and restore the lineage, find themselves right at home in the Northern European and Germanic tangent traditions. It is well known now that swords and other such items were frequently deposited, or rather sacrificed, literally made sacred, to the other side, in bogs or burial sites, as scholar Stephen Flowers says in his Mystery of the Goths. Without question, such symbolic weapons would have been handed down from generation to generation. Often such objects were buried for a time and then recovered by the family or heir to the previous owner. The object would thus gain in power for having been, for a time, in the other world. The Gothic tradition is a body of literature fundamentally concerned with the boundaries between past and present, reality and the supernatural, morality and immorality, guilty and victimization, and reason and faith or superstition. Laura Johnson, The Gothic Tradition. Family secrets buried by extreme violence, waiting to be unearthed by a chosen descendant that will either break the curse or succumb to it. But Hervor ain't playing around, and threatens her own father she'll lay a spell on dead men to keep them from what I'm assuming is either Valhalla or maybe Elfheim, as to rot in their graves instead. Sort of reverse damsel in distress here, the lady giving the terms to the spooky Draugr. Angantyr recognizes this ferocity in Hervor, half complimenting her that she's unlike to men, that she's brave or foolish enough to visit the burial mounds at night with an inlaid carved spear and the Goth's medal. Quote, I declare you, young maiden, unlike to men, as ye go from the mound in the night, with an inlaid spear and the Goth's medal, with helmet and byrnie before the doors of the hall. So Hervor is literally described as wearing Gothic armor, in which I am trying to connect Gothic horror and literature tropes to this Old Norse poem. Our main character survives the story this time, and if anything, it seems that the undead should be the thankful ones. Hervor will remain steadfast, despite it being described that everything is burning around her, and she'll eventually leave with the sword. Her sons and granddaughter, or her historically misplaced self, will have their own tales later on. And with the possible etymological connection between the sword's name, Tyrfinger, and the possible Tervingi tribe, which was another tribe that was maybe involved with these Gothic Hun conflicts that were related to the Goths, and maybe this is a sort of signal of intertribal, strife, especially on the eve of sort of an Armageddon, right? We have these Huns that are supposedly encroaching on their territory, sort of an existential threat, and yet they also have this infighting at the same time, and maybe that sort of reflects both conditions, a sort of inner struggle reflecting in a sort of outer struggle too, and that this whole sword curse is essentially related to this infighting, this familial blood curse, or familial blood feud, or something like that. And if you're interested in the Samso story now, I'll lay that out. For the longest time, I used to play this game called League of Legends, and I was hyper obsessed with it, so I started playing that back in like 2012, and I named my summoner name after a song called Samso, and the song was by an artist called Pretty Lights. And it would actually come maybe a couple of years after I started playing that Pretty Lights even did a custom song for League of Legends, it just so happened. And one of the songs, oddly to me, kind of sounds like a more electrified version of the Samso song itself. So it's just sort of ironic that, years later, I find myself very hyper obsessed and interested in Odin, and I sort of find that, wow, he actually has a lot of presence and sort of association with this island of Samso. I'd always known that Samso was an island. I just didn't know about any Norse history or Viking history, anything like that at the time when I chose that summoner name, was even interested in the song. So just interesting how things always seem to come around again at some point, and I always like to document my synchronicities on this channel. So if you like that, there's my little gem for you. So that's going to be it for this video. I just thought it would be interesting to lay out some of these interesting tropes that I sort of saw in this poem that I was reading, and was like, hey, a lot of this just kind of sounds like a setup for sort of Gothic horror story, except that it's inverted and sort of flipped on its head, that it's a shield maiden and she's kind of like a badass the whole time, and that it even uses the word Gothic itself in it to describe it. So I thought that maybe some of these translations, I think someone pointed out in my comments when I initially wrote this as an essay on Substack, that perhaps this translation of this poem is maybe hot off the presses at around this time of Walpole and all these other publications, and so maybe that's why it's related, or maybe there's some inspiration there to be had between the poem and actually the Gothic literature tropes itself. So let me know if you have any more information on that. Yeah, so the next time that you think about Gothic horror, you can always think about maybe that there's like some Viking elements to it somehow, okay? So if you like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Check all the links down below in the descriptions, like our Substacks and Patreon for Discord access and weekly book club meetings. So we'll see you all on the next video, everyone. Nullius and Verba.